In the sweltering heat of a military training ground in Texas, 1943, a crowd of hardened soldiers gathered around what seemed impossible. A target had been placed 1,200 yards away, so distant it appeared as a mere speck against the desert horizon. The wind was howling at 15 miles per hour, creating dust devils that danced across the barren landscape. Even with the most advanced rifles of the time, hitting such a target would be considered miraculous. "No one can hit that," muttered Sergeant William Bull Morrison, a decorated veteran of the Great War whose reputation as the finest marksman in the regiment was legendary. He had seen combat in France, survived the trenches, and earned 3 Purple Hearts. His weathered hands had guided countless recruits through basic training, and his eagle eyes could spot enemy movement from impossible distances. If Bull Morrison said something couldn't be done with a rifle, it was gospel truth. But standing quietly at the back of the crowd was someone no one expected, a young woman whose presence on this military base defied every convention of the 1940s. She didn't wear a uniform, didn't carry herself like a soldier, and certainly didn't look like someone who belonged among these battle-tested warriors. Yet in her steady gaze, and the way she unconsciously calculated wind speed and distance, there was something that spoke of an entirely different kind of training. What happened next would not only shatter every assumption about gender, ability, and the nature of true marksmanship, but would also change the course of military training forever. This is the story of how one silent shot echoed through history, proving that extraordinary skill can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful messages. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Bullis as 23-year-old Eleanor "Ellie" Catherine Webb stepped off the dusty military transport truck. Her brown leather suitcase contained little more than a few dresses, some books, and a carefully wrapped photograph of her father in his World War I uniform. She certainly didn't look like someone who would revolutionize military marksmanship training, but appearances, as the saying goes, can be deceiving. Ellie had arrived at the Texas military base not as a soldier, but as a civilian contractor hired by the War Department to document training procedures for a comprehensive manual being compiled for new recruits. The year 1943 had brought unprecedented challenges to American military training, with the need to rapidly prepare hundreds of thousands of young men for combat overseas. The military brass believed that detailed documentation of their most effective training methods could help standardize and improve the process across all bases. What they didn't know was that Ellie Webb carried with her a secret that would soon challenge everything they thought they knew about shooting. Growing up in the remote mountains of Montana, Ellie had learned to shoot out of necessity rather than sport. Her father, Thomas Webb, had been a hunting guide before the Great War, and after returning home with injuries that left him partially disabled, he had passed on his knowledge to his only child. From the age of 7, Ellie accompanied him on hunting expeditions that were less about recreation and more about survival. In the harsh Montana winters, a missed shot could mean the difference between a family having meat for the week or going hungry. Her father had been an unusual teacher. Unlike most men of his generation, Thomas Webb believed that precision shooting was about patience, observation, and understanding rather than brute force or masculine bravado. He taught Ellie to read the wind by watching grass movements, to judge distance by the way sound traveled, and to control her breathing so completely that her heartbeat wouldn't disturb her aim. Most importantly, he taught her that the best shooters weren't those who talked the loudest about their abilities, but those who remained quiet and focused when it mattered most. By the time Ellie turned 16, she could consistently hit targets that experienced hunters missed. Local legends began to grow around the quiet Webb girl who could drop a running deer at 300 yards or pick off a threatening wolf from distances that seemed impossible. But in the conservative social environment of 1930s Montana, such skills in a young woman were seen as curiosities rather than achievements worthy of recognition. When America entered World War II, Ellie's typing skills and college education landed her a job with the War Department's documentation division. Her assignment to Camp Bullis was meant to be routine. Spend 3 months observing training procedures, interview instructors and recruits, and compile comprehensive reports that could be used to improve military education nationwide. What she found at Camp Bullis, however, was a training system that seemed almost primitive compared to what her father had taught her in the Montana wilderness. The base's shooting instructors relied heavily on volume training, the belief that if recruits fired enough rounds, they would eventually develop accuracy through repetition. The emphasis was on rapid firing, aggressive positioning, and achieving minimum qualifying scores rather than developing true marksmanship skills. Most recruits were taught to shoot from standard positions using techniques that prioritized speed over precision. Sergeant Morrison, known throughout the base as Bull, epitomized this approach. A massive man with hands like ham hocks and a voice that could be heard across 3 training fields, Bull had earned his reputation through sheer determination and countless hours of practice. He genuinely believed that shooting was fundamentally about strength, endurance, and the masculine ability to withstand the physical demands of combat conditions. During her first week at the base, Ellie quietly observed dozens of training sessions. She watched young recruits struggle with rifles that seemed too large for their frames, firing at targets placed at distances that were often beyond their current skill level. The instruction focused on achieving passing scores rather than developing underlying techniques that would serve these soldiers well under actual combat conditions. The waste troubled her. She calculated that the base was expending thousands of rounds daily with relatively little improvement in overall marksmanship capabilities. More concerning was the number of recruits who developed bad habits that would be difficult to correct later. Poor breathing techniques, improper stance, and rushed shot timing were being reinforced through repetitive practice rather than corrected through careful instruction. But Ellie said nothing. Her role was to observe and document, not to critique or suggest improvements. As a civilian woman in a military environment, she understood that her presence was already unusual enough without drawing additional attention to herself. She conducted her interviews professionally, took detailed notes, and maintained the quiet demeanor that had served her well throughout her life. The shooting range became her primary area of focus because marksmanship training consumed such a significant portion of the base's time and resources. Every day, she positioned herself at various observation points, documenting the techniques being taught and the results being achieved. She noted the different personality types among the instructors, the varying skill levels of recruits, and the environmental factors that affected shooting accuracy. What became clear to her was that very few people at Camp Bullis truly understood the science of precision shooting. The instruction was based primarily on military tradition and the personal experiences of combat veterans rather than systematic analysis of what actually worked most effectively. While the veterans' experience was valuable, it often included techniques that had been developed under specific battlefield conditions that didn't necessarily translate to optimal training methods. Ellie began to see patterns that the instructors missed. Recruits who struggled with the standard rapid-firing techniques often showed natural aptitude for precision shooting when they accidentally slowed down their pace. Environmental conditions were rarely factored into training schedules, meaning that recruits practiced in ideal conditions that bore little resemblance to the varied circumstances they would face in actual combat. Most significantly, she observed that the competitive atmosphere encouraged recruits to rush their shots and claim hits that were questionable rather than acknowledge misses that could be used as learning opportunities. The emphasis on immediate results was undermining the development of long-term skills. As the weeks passed, Ellie found herself mentally calculating wind speed and distance during every training session. Her father's teachings were so deeply ingrained that she automatically analyzed every shot she witnessed, understanding instinctively why certain attempts succeeded while others failed. She began to see the shooting range not as a place where soldiers were trained, but as a laboratory where human potential was being systematically underutilized. The turning point came during her 4th week at the base. She was documenting an advanced marksmanship session where the most skilled recruits were attempting to qualify for specialized sniper training. The session was being conducted under the direct supervision of Sergeant Morrison, who took personal pride in the performance of his advanced students. The target had been placed at 800 yards, which was considered the maximum effective range for the M1903 Springfield rifles being used. Even for experienced shooters, hitting such a target required exceptional skill, particularly given the gusty wind conditions that day. Of the 12 recruits attempting qualification, only 3 had managed to achieve hits after multiple attempts each. Sergeant Morrison was clearly frustrated. These were his best students, young men who had shown exceptional promise during basic training. Their failure to perform at this distance reflected poorly on his instruction methods and called into question his reputation as the base's premier marksmanship trainer. The wind's too strong today, Morrison announced to the gathered observers, which included several officers evaluating the sniper training program. No point in continuing under these conditions. We'll reschedule when the weather's more suitable. But, as he spoke, Ellie was observing the wind patterns with the analytical eye her father had trained. The gusts were strong but consistent, creating predictable drift patterns that could be calculated and compensated for. The conditions were actually ideal for teaching advanced wind reading skills, if the instructors understood how to approach the challenge systematically. She said nothing, of course. But, in her mind, she was already calculating the precise adjustments needed to compensate for the wind speed, direction, and distance. The shot was difficult, but entirely possible for someone who understood the variables involved. That evening, alone in her temporary quarters, Ellie found herself thinking about the missed opportunity she had witnessed. 12 promising young soldiers had left the range believing that certain conditions made accurate shooting impossible, when in fact those conditions simply required different techniques and more careful analysis. She thought about her father's words from years earlier. The best teachers aren't those who show off their abilities, Ellie. They're the ones who help others discover abilities they didn't know they had. For the first time since arriving at Camp Bullis, Eleanor Webb began to wonder if her role at the base might involve more than just documentation. But she also understood that challenging the established system would require more than quiet observation and written reports. It would require a demonstration that no one could ignore. The next morning brought news that would set the stage for everything that followed. Colonel Harrison Mitchell, the base commander, had announced that Camp Bullis would be hosting a special demonstration for visiting military officials from Washington. The War Department was evaluating training programs across the country, looking to identify the most effective methods for rapid deployment to other bases. The pressure was enormous. Camp Bullis had built its reputation on producing competent soldiers quickly, but the visiting officials would be comparing their results to bases across the nation. The demonstration needed to showcase not just adequate training, but exceptional capabilities that would justify the base's funding and expansion. Sergeant Morrison found himself at the center of this pressure. As the head marksmanship instructor, his portion of the demonstration would be crucial to the base's evaluation. He had 2 weeks to prepare a presentation that would impress officials who had already seen the best that military training had to offer. The challenge was complicated by recent reports from overseas. Combat veterans returning from North Africa and the Pacific were describing shooting scenarios that differed significantly from traditional training expectations. Enemy snipers were engaging at longer ranges, environmental conditions were more extreme, and the psychological pressures of actual combat were revealing weaknesses in soldiers who had performed well during stateside training. Morrison spent sleepless nights reviewing training records and attempting to design a demonstration that would address these new realities while showcasing his program's strengths. The traditional approach of demonstrating accuracy at standard ranges under ideal conditions suddenly seemed inadequate given what they were learning about actual combat requirements. During this period, Ellie continued her documentation work with growing fascination. The pressure surrounding the upcoming demonstration was revealing aspects of the training program that hadn't been apparent during routine operations. Instructors were pushing their students harder, experimenting with different techniques, and openly discussing the limitations of current methods. She attended planning meetings where she was largely ignored, taking notes while officers debated the best way to present their capabilities. The conversations revealed a military establishment that was beginning to question its own methods, but wasn't sure how to adapt to changing requirements. The breakthrough moment came during a particularly heated discussion between Morrison and Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, the base's second-in-command. Patterson had served in the Pacific and carried with him first-hand knowledge of the challenges American forces were facing against Japanese snipers. "Bull, what you're planning won't impress anyone who's seen what our boys are up against overseas," Patterson said bluntly. The enemy is hitting our soldiers from ranges that our training doesn't even address. We need to demonstrate capabilities that match real-world requirements, not just traditional qualification standards. Morrison's face reddened with frustration. Sir, with respect, we're training regular infantry, not specialized snipers. The equipment and techniques required for extreme-range shooting are beyond what most recruits can master in basic training. Then, maybe we need to rethink what basic training should include, Patterson replied. Because I've read reports of Japanese snipers engaging our forces at over 1,000 yards. If our soldiers can't respond effectively to that threat, we're sending them into battle unprepared. The debate continued for an hour, with both men presenting valid arguments, but no clear resolution. The demonstration was only 10 days away, and they still hadn't settled on an approach that would satisfy both practical limitations and the need to impress the visiting officials. Ellie listened to this exchange with growing excitement. Here was a clear example of the gap between current training methods and actual requirements. Her documentation would certainly need to include this disconnect, but, more importantly, she realized she might have insights that could help bridge that gap. That evening, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply documenting the problems she had observed, she would write a detailed analysis that included specific recommendations for improvement. Her report would go beyond describing current methods to suggest alternative approaches based on her own experience and observations. Working late into the night, Ellie began drafting what she privately called a scientific approach to military marksmanship training. The document drew heavily on her father's teachings, but presented them in the formal, technical language that military officials would find credible. She began with an analysis of environmental factors that were typically ignored in training scenarios. Most shooting instruction treated wind, temperature, and lighting as obstacles to be overcome rather than variables to be understood and utilized. Her father had taught her that exceptional shooters didn't fight against environmental conditions. They learned to work with them. The report included detailed discussions of breathing techniques, body positioning, and mental preparation methods that differed significantly from standard military instruction. Where traditional training emphasized rapid engagement and minimum qualifying scores, Ellie's recommendations focused on developing fundamental skills that would serve soldiers effectively under varied conditions. Most revolutionary was her section on distance shooting. While standard training rarely addressed targets beyond 500 yards, Ellie's analysis demonstrated that with proper technique and understanding, soldiers could be trained to engage effectively at much greater ranges. The key was not superior physical strength or exceptional eyesight, but systematic training in observation, calculation, and patience. As she wrote, Ellie found herself thinking about the upcoming demonstration. The visiting officials would be looking for innovation and effectiveness, not just adherence to traditional methods. If Camp Bullis could demonstrate capabilities that exceeded standard expectations, it would certainly enhance the base's reputation and funding prospects. But she also understood that her recommendations would be meaningless without proof. Military officials were practical people who required evidence of effectiveness rather than theoretical discussions. Any suggestion for changing established training methods would need to be backed by demonstrable results. The next day brought unexpected opportunity. During her morning observation session, Ellie overheard Morrison discussing his plans for the demonstration with his assistant instructors. The session would include various skill demonstrations, but the centerpiece would be long-range accuracy testing designed to showcase the advanced capabilities of their best marksmen. Morrison had decided to push the boundaries of what was considered possible with standard military rifles. Instead of the usual qualification distances, he planned to demonstrate accuracy at 1,000 yards, using conditions that would simulate the challenges soldiers faced in actual combat situations. If we can show consistent hits at that range, even with environmental challenges, it'll prove that our training produces results that exceed standard expectations, Morrison explained to his team. The question is whether our boys can deliver under pressure. As Ellie listened, she realized that Morrison was essentially planning to demonstrate exactly the type of shooting that her report recommended as standard training goals. The irony was that he was approaching it as an exceptional demonstration rather than recognizing it as a fundamental skill that could be taught systematically. That afternoon, she made another crucial decision. She would complete her written recommendations and submit them through official channels, but she would also offer to provide a practical demonstration of the techniques she was advocating. If Morrison's students could achieve exceptional results using her suggested methods, it would provide the proof that military officials needed to take her recommendations seriously. The challenge was finding a way to make this offer without appearing to criticize current methods or overstep her role as a civilian observer. Military protocol was strict, and any suggestion that a young woman could improve upon established training methods would likely be met with skepticism or outright hostility. She spent the evening crafting a carefully worded memorandum to Colonel Mitchell. The document presented her findings as scientific observations rather than criticisms, and her offer to assist with the demonstration was framed as an opportunity to validate the research she had been conducting. The memorandum emphasized that her suggestions were based on documented observation of training effectiveness rather than personal opinion. She included statistical analysis of shot accuracy under various conditions, environmental factors that correlated with improved performance, and specific recommendations that could be implemented within existing training frameworks. Most importantly, she offered to provide a practical demonstration of long-range shooting techniques that could enhance the upcoming presentation to visiting officials. The offer was presented as a service to the base rather than a challenge to existing authority, emphasizing her desire to contribute to military effectiveness rather than personal recognition. The next morning, Ellie submitted her memorandum through proper channels and waited. She understood that her suggestions might be dismissed or ignored, but she also knew that the upcoming demonstration represented a unique opportunity to prove that alternative training methods could produce superior results. What she didn't anticipate was the chain of events that her simple memorandum would set in motion. Within hours of its submission, her document had reached Colonel Mitchell's desk and sparked discussions that would ultimately lead to the most significant challenge of her life. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not only her shooting abilities, but her conviction that quiet competence could triumph over loud skepticism. The visiting officials from Washington were still a week away, but the real test was about to begin much sooner than anyone expected. Colonel Mitchell's office fell silent as he finished reading Ellie's memorandum for the second time. The document was unlike anything he had encountered in 23 years of military service. Here was a civilian contractor, a young woman nonetheless, proposing fundamental changes to marksmanship training based on what appeared to be sophisticated analysis of their current methods. The timing couldn't have been more significant. With the Washington officials arriving in just over a week, Mitchell was under enormous pressure to present Camp Bullis as a model of military training excellence. The War Department was consolidating resources and closing less effective facilities. This demonstration could determine the future of the base and the careers of everyone associated with it. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, who had been advocating for more realistic training standards, saw immediate potential in Ellie's recommendations. "Sir, this analysis addresses exactly the concerns I've been raising about combat readiness," he told Mitchell. "If her techniques can actually produce the results she claims, we'd be demonstrating capabilities that exceed anything the other bases can show." But Mitchell was cautious. Allowing a civilian woman to participate in a critical military demonstration was unprecedented and potentially disastrous. If Ellie failed to deliver on her claims, it would reflect poorly on his judgment and the base's credibility. Yet if her methods proved effective, it could establish Camp Bullis as the premier training facility in the country. The decision was complicated further by Sergeant Morrison's reaction. When informed about Ellie's memorandum, Morrison was skeptical and somewhat offended. He had spent his entire adult life perfecting his understanding of military marksmanship, and the suggestion that a civilian observer had identified fundamental improvements in his methods was difficult to accept. "Colonel, with all due respect, this woman has been here less than a month," Morrison argued. "She's never served in combat, never trained soldiers under pressure, and certainly never dealt with the realities of preparing young men for battle. Her theoretical ideas might sound impressive on paper, but they have no basis in practical experience." Morrison's concerns weren't entirely unreasonable. Military training had evolved through decades of trial and error tested under combat conditions, and refined by the experiences of countless veterans. Changing established methods based on civilian observations, regardless of how detailed those observations might be, represented a significant risk. But Patterson countered with his own combat experience. "Bull, I've seen what happens when our training doesn't match battlefield requirements," he said firmly. "Japanese snipers are picking off our soldiers from ranges that our training never addressed. If this woman has insights that could save American lives, don't we have an obligation to test them?" The debate continued for hours, with Mitchell weighing the potential benefits against the obvious risks. Finally, he reached a decision that surprised everyone involved. Instead of simply dismissing Ellie's recommendations or accepting them without verification, he would arrange a private test that would allow her to demonstrate her claimed abilities without risking public embarrassment. The test would be conducted the following day, with only a small group of observers present. If Ellie could prove that her techniques were effective, Mitchell would consider incorporating them into the official demonstration. If she failed, the matter would be quietly dropped and never mentioned again. That evening, word of the upcoming test spread through the base despite efforts to keep it confidential. Military bases are small communities where information travels quickly, and the prospect of a civilian woman challenging the shooting expertise of the base's most experienced marksman was too unusual to remain secret. Reactions among the soldiers varied widely. Some were genuinely curious about what this quiet observer might have learned during her weeks of documentation. Others were skeptical or dismissive, unable to believe that someone without military training could offer meaningful improvements to established methods. The most vocal opposition came from a group of Morrison's advanced students who had been selected for the Washington demonstration. These young men had worked hard to achieve their status as the base's elite marksmen, and they viewed any suggestion that their training was inadequate as a personal insult. No amount of theory can replace that. But there were also soldiers who remembered their struggles with the current training methods and wondered if alternative approaches might be more effective. Private First Class David Kim, a quiet young man from California who had shown natural shooting aptitude but struggled with the aggressive techniques favored by the instructors, was particularly intrigued by the possibility of different methods. "Maybe she's seen something we've all missed," Kim confided to his friend. "I know I shoot better when I slow down and think about what I'm doing, but the instructors keep pushing us to fire faster. If she has ideas about precision shooting, I'd like to hear them." Meanwhile, Ellie spent a sleepless night preparing for the test that would either validate her recommendations or end her involvement in military training forever. She reviewed her father's teachings, practiced the breathing exercises and mental preparation techniques he had taught her, and tried to ignore the growing anxiety about performing under scrutiny. The pressure was unlike anything she had experienced in Montana. There, her shooting had been a private matter between her and her father, with success measured by whether the family would have meat for dinner rather than by the approval of military officials. Tomorrow, she would be performing for an audience that was largely skeptical of her abilities and eager to see her fail. But she also understood that this was about more than personal validation. If her techniques could improve military training, they might help save the lives of young soldiers who would face combat with whatever skills their training had provided. The responsibility was enormous, but it also gave her the motivation to push aside her fears and focus on the task ahead. The test was scheduled for dawn, when wind conditions would be most predictable and environmental factors could be carefully controlled. Morrison had selected a target placement that would challenge even his most skilled students. 1,200 yards across rough terrain, with natural obstacles and varying elevations that would test every aspect of marksmanship technique. As the night wore on, Ellie found herself thinking about her father's final lesson before she left Montana. Thomas Webb had taken her to a high ridge overlooking their valley and pointed toward a weather vane on a barn nearly a mile away. "Ellie, the day might come when everything depends on one shot," he had said quietly. "When that happens, remember that shooting isn't about the rifle or the target or even your skill with the weapon. It's about understanding your place in the world well enough to put the bullet exactly where it needs to go." At the time, she had thought he was being overly dramatic. Now, facing the most important test of her life, she realized that he had been preparing her for exactly this moment. Tomorrow would prove whether years of patient teaching and careful observation had been enough to prepare her for a challenge that could change everything. The dawn was still hours away, but across Camp Bullis, people were already talking about the test that would determine whether a quiet woman from Montana could deliver on promises that seemed too good to be true. For Ellie Webb, the long night of waiting was almost over. Dawn broke over Camp Bullis with an unusual stillness that seemed to hold the entire base in suspense. By 6 o'clock in the morning, a small but significant crowd had gathered at the long-range shooting facility despite the early hour and official attempts to keep the test private. Word had spread through the barracks, and curiosity had overcome protocol. Colonel Mitchell arrived to find not only the authorized observers, but also dozens of soldiers who had found reasons to be in the vicinity. Rather than order them away and create a scene, he decided to allow the informal audience to remain. Perhaps, he reasoned, having witnesses would add appropriate pressure to ensure that any claims made could be thoroughly verified. The target had been placed at precisely 1,200 yards, positioned on a slight rise that would challenge depth perception and require careful calculation of trajectory. The morning wind was gusting at 12 to 15 miles per hour from the southwest, creating the kind of variable conditions that would test even experienced marksmen. A series of flags placed at intervals across the range showed the complex wind patterns that would affect any projectile's flight path. Sergeant Morrison supervised the setup with his usual attention to detail, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his movements. This test represented more than a simple demonstration of shooting ability. It was a challenge to everything he had built his reputation upon, and the outcome would affect his standing with both his superiors and his students. Ellie arrived at the range carrying only a small notebook and wearing the same simple dress she had worn throughout her time at the base. She showed no obvious signs of nervousness, but her quiet demeanor was even more pronounced than usual. Those observing her closely noticed that she spent several minutes simply standing still and watching the wind flags, making mental calculations that no one else could follow. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson approached her with a mixture of encouragement and concern. "Miss Webb, I want you to know that regardless of the outcome today, your analysis has already provided valuable insights into our training methods," he said quietly. "There's no shame if the conditions prove too challenging." Ellie thanked him politely, but said little else. She was already entering the mental state her father had taught her to achieve before important shots, a condition of focused calm where external pressures faded and only the fundamental elements of marksmanship remained relevant. The rifle selected for the test was a standard M1903 Springfield, identical to those used by recruits throughout their training. Morrison had insisted on this choice to ensure that no specialized equipment could account for any success Ellie might achieve. The weapon was well maintained, but unremarkable, representing exactly the type of tool that ordinary soldiers would have available in combat situations. Before beginning, Colonel Mitchell addressed the gathered observers. "What we're witnessing today is a scientific test of alternative training methodologies," he announced. "Regardless of the outcome, this exercise is designed to expand our understanding of effective marksmanship instruction. Miss Webb will have 3 opportunities to demonstrate the techniques she has recommended in her analysis. 3 shots. The pressure of that limitation was not lost on anyone present. Morrison's best students typically required 5 to 10 attempts before achieving hits at this distance under similar conditions. Allowing only 3 shots was both a reasonable test and a significant handicap that would require exceptional consistency to overcome. As Ellie took her position, the crowd fell silent. Even those who had been most skeptical found themselves curious about what would happen next. She spent nearly 5 minutes simply observing conditions before touching the rifle, using techniques that no one at Camp Bullis had ever seen employed in military training. Her father had taught her that preparation was more important than execution, and that understanding the environment was the foundation of accurate shooting. She noted the wind patterns not just at her position and the target, but at multiple points along the bullet's trajectory. She observed how heat shimmer from the warming ground would affect visibility and calculated the precise adjustments needed for the distance and elevation. When she finally took her shooting position, even Morrison had to admit that her form was unlike anything he had seen before. Where military training emphasized aggressive, stable positions designed for rapid engagement, Ellie's posture was relaxed yet controlled, optimized for precision rather than speed. Her breathing pattern was different as well. Instead of the forceful control taught in military training, she used a gentle rhythm that seemed to flow naturally with her body's requirements. To the experienced marksman watching, it appeared almost casual, as if she were preparing for a leisurely afternoon of target practice rather than the most important shot of her life. But there was nothing casual about the calculation behind her preparation. Every movement was deliberate, based on years of training that had emphasized understanding over power, patience over aggression. When she finally settled into her final position, she had already made all the mental adjustments needed to compensate for wind, distance, and environmental conditions. The first shot rang out with startling suddenness. Despite the long preparation, Ellie's actual firing sequence was quick and smooth, without the extended hold and visible strain that characterized most long-range attempts. The rifle's report echoed across the range, followed by an expectant silence as everyone waited for the target to be checked. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson had positioned himself with binoculars focused on the target area. After what seemed like an eternity, he announced the result in a voice that carried a note of surprise. Hit. Approximately 6 inches from center. A murmur ran through the crowd. 6 inches from center at 1,200 yards was exceptional shooting under any circumstances, particularly for a first attempt in challenging wind conditions. Even Morrison had to acknowledge that the shot represented skill that exceeded most of his advanced students. But Ellie showed no reaction to the result. She was already preparing for her second attempt, making minor adjustments based on what the first shot had revealed about actual conditions. Her father had taught her that the first shot was often informational, providing data that could be used to refine subsequent attempts. The second shot came after a shorter preparation period, suggesting that she was gaining confidence in her reading of the conditions. This time, Patterson's announcement was immediate and clearly excited. Dead center hit. The crowd erupted in surprised conversation and scattered applause. A bullseye at 1,200 yards was extraordinary by any standard, achieved by perhaps one marksman in 1,000 under ideal conditions. That Ellie had accomplished it as her second shot, in gusty winds, was almost impossible to believe. But she was already preparing for her third and final attempt. This shot would determine whether her success was due to exceptional skill or remarkable luck. 2 good shots could be dismissed as coincidence, but 3 would prove the effectiveness of her techniques beyond any reasonable doubt. The preparation for the third shot was the longest yet, as Ellie seemed to be processing everything she had learned from the previous attempts. The wind had shifted slightly, and she spent additional time calculating the new adjustments needed. When she finally fired, the shot seemed to come at the perfect moment when all conditions had aligned. Patterson's voice was steady but carried undertones of amazement. Center hit. Actually closer to perfect center than the second shot. The silence that followed was profound. 3 shots, 3 hits, with 2 of them achieving accuracy that would be considered exceptional under any circumstances. The demonstration had proven beyond doubt that Ellie's techniques were not only effective, but superior to the methods currently being taught. Morrison was the first to break the silence, approaching Ellie with a mixture of respect and curiosity that replaced his earlier skepticism. Miss Webb, I've been teaching marksmanship for 15 years, and I've never seen shooting like that. Would you be willing to explain how you achieved those results? What followed was an impromptu lesson that captivated everyone present. Ellie described the environmental analysis techniques her father had taught her, explaining how wind patterns could be read and predicted rather than simply endured. She demonstrated the breathing and positioning methods that optimized natural body stability rather than fighting against it. Most importantly, she explained the mental approach that treated long-range shooting as a problem-solving exercise rather than a test of physical strength or courage. The techniques she described were logical and teachable, based on scientific principles rather than military tradition. Colonel Mitchell listened with growing excitement as he realized that Ellie's methods could revolutionize their training program and provide exactly the kind of innovation that would impress the Washington officials. Here was demonstrable proof that Camp Bullis could produce capabilities that exceeded standard military expectations. But the most significant moment came when Private Kim, who had been struggling with traditional training methods, asked if he cowl.